George Washington in 1791 headed south in April, and he traveled 1,900 miles in 3 months. And he went with a very small entourage. He had his secretary with him, he had a baggage wagon with some handlers, a few servants, and that was about it. And then he also brought along his big white warhorse, Prescott, and his dog. His name was Cornwallis. Who said George didn't have a sense of humor? The books that I'm working on, or the first one I wrote was called Baptist and Bootleggers, and it was a prohibition expedition through the South with cocktail recipes. A lot of books have been written about prohibition, but really none of them talked about the South. And because we went dry before the rest of the country did, we got really good at making illegal booze and bringing in rum and all this stuff and supplying the rest of the country. The prohibition expedition, the purpose of it was to figure out just how we got to be such a nation of drunkards, and then why it was necessary to have a temperance movement followed by prohibition, followed by rejecting prohibition. So by the early 19th century, the amount of alcohol being drunk in the United States averaged about 7.2 gallons per adult. Now that is pure alcohol. That's not gallons of beer, gallons of wine, even gallons of whiskey. It's pure alcohol. And to compare it to today, the average is about 2.6 gallons. One of the reasons was the water was so bad. So you would drink beer all day long, and you'd start with what they call small beer, which was very watered down, and it would get harder and harder and harder as the day went on. But even children drank hard cider and beer for breakfast. And then they started distilling alcohol from grain, and it just got to be a bigger and bigger problem. So let's compare what it was like to follow George Washington's trail in 2022 and then making it in 1791. Well, you didn't have motels.com. You didn't have GPS. You didn't have highways that were paved. You didn't have any way of knowing when you were going to get from point A to point B. You might have a horse who goes lame or loses his shoe, or the ferry may not be operating, the river could have gone dry, all kinds of things had gone on. So it was quite a challenge to make this trip. Now, he had planned it very carefully, and he had written ahead to the leaders of the various cities they were planning to visit and saying, we expect to be here on such and such a day. Start out here at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon was begun in 1734, as I said, by George's father, and within about 50 years of his death, the place was just falling in. And a South Carolina woman took it upon herself to save Mount Vernon. She started the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, bought the land and house from the last of the Washington's descendants. This is right before the Civil War, and it's still operated by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association today. It's open 365 days a year because George and Martha never turned away a visitor, even on Christmas. We know that George Washington was the father of our country. He was also the father of distilling. After his presidency, he had 2 years before he died. He came home, he had hired a new farm manager who was a Scot. His name was John Anderson, and he told George that he could make a lot more money distilling his grain crops rather than making them into flour. The distillery was so successful that in the first year that George had an entire building built and had 5 stills that turned out 11,000 gallons of rye whiskey. And the stuff was sold to the taverns in Alexandria, and he made so much money on it that it became the largest profit center at Mount Vernon. The guy kind of in the center with the gray vest is named Steve Bashore. He came to work at Mount Vernon as their traditional miller, which means he operates the mill that is just like it was in Washington's day. About the time he came to work there, they had uncovered the archaeological fittings of the original distillery and decided to rebuild it just as sort of a demonstration project. And what he's holding is a mash rake that he's raking around in a barrel. Nowadays, they produce about 1,000 gallons of rye whiskey a year, and they distill twice a year, whereas George Washington was running his still, 24/7. So the next stop on George's trip was Fredericksburg. This is a tavern that was open during George Washington's day. It's called Rising Sun, and originally it was built by his brother Charles, who was kind of the black sheep of the family. And George had certainly had meals in Charles's house. A tavern in the days after that would be a place where you could get a meal, you could get a drink in the common room in the bar, and you could rent bedrooms upstairs, ranging from a really nice bedroom with a bed to like a sack of corn husk on the floor, and you had to sleep next to people you didn't know. So it was referred to by the tour guide as the Airbnb of the 18th century. And George had to stay in places like there. Alexander Hamilton, who was George Washington's Treasury Secretary, came to the idea of starting an excise tax on whiskey to pay for the debts of the Revolution. It was very controversial, but they consolidated all the debts of the different colonies and now the states and took it all under them as federal debt. Some states had a lot more debt than others, so they were really happy about it. The ones who didn't have debt were not too happy. But anyway, the excise tax was thought to be a good way to raise a lot of money. But that did not sit well with some of the small producers in Pennsylvania and Kentucky, and they started attacking the revenue collectors, and even the people they found out were paying their tax. They would steal the mail and read their mail and find out that they were paying the tax. So George Washington called out 15,000 militia members and put down the rebellion. That was in 1794. This was a bigger army than he had ever led during the Revolution, and Alexander Hamilton went with him. But it was a very important test of the new country's constitution and its right to exist. We are going on to Richmond, Virginia, which of course is kind of Thomas Jefferson's town, but it's got George Washington's fingerprints all over it. And the way they would welcome George Washington to town was they shoot off cannons at him. They would have big illuminations at night. Everybody would put candles in all their windows. And they would have these big parties with toast. And after every toast, and there might be 15 toasts, they would shoot off the artillery. So this statue of George Washington was commissioned after his visit in 1791. It was the work of a French sculptor named Jean-Antoine Houdon, who Thomas Jefferson had met while he was ambassador to Paris. George Washington never saw it, but people who knew him and saw the statue said it was a perfect likeness. There is a ladies' monument to the prominent women of Virginia. Martha Washington is there. Most of them are not people that are well known, but this very interesting lady was a suffragette named Adele Clark, who was an artist, and she would draw attention to her cause by sitting around the square painting and drawing them. People would stop to talk to her. She would let them have it about the suffragist movement. I don't know if she was also in favor of prohibition, but she probably was, because those were two intertwined movements because they were about women's rights. When women were married to drunks, they had really no recourse except to stay with them because they couldn't own property. Their husband owned their property. If they left, he got the children. So we also went to the Jefferson Hotel, my aunt and I. And that has this big old statue of Thomas Jefferson and this rotunda that looks like, something you expect to see at the Vatican or maybe a fancy department store in Paris. And they also have life-size alligators there, which may seem strange, but back in the day, people would go to Florida and they'd bring home these cute little baby alligators as souvenirs, and once the alligators got too big to keep in the bathtub, they would bring them over to the Jefferson Hotel to live in the fish pond. We made a side trip to Washington, North Carolina, which I'd never heard of before, but it is the first city in the country to name itself after George Washington. But the nice lady at the visitor center there corrected me when I said President Washington. She said, "Oh no, we're named for General Washington." They took the name in 1776. So this is when George Washington resigned his commission and had his farewell with his officers. This is a Courier in print, and you'll see that he's holding a little wine glass, and there's some wine on the table. Our next stop was New Bern, North Carolina, which had been the capital of colonial North Carolina. This is the Tryon Palace. I didn't get to go in it because they were closing, but it's a fake. The real Tryon Palace burned down in like 1809, and they built a new one in the 1950s. This is the house where George Washington stayed. It had been empty for a couple of years because the owners had all died of yellow fever. So they scoured the place out, borrowed a bunch of furniture, and that's where George stayed during his visit. Now, Wilmington, North Carolina was also a major city, port city at that time, and it's also where my father grew up during World War II, and we were very surprised that the only mention of George Washington is this marker here, between two trash cans and a fire hydrant. From there to Georgetown, this is the house where George Washington stayed. And unfortunately, it is now in private hands, and the owner will run you off if you come close to it. So you have to kind of stand on the sidewalk and gawk, as I did the other day. And if you stand there too long, he'll come to the door with these four great big white dogs, and they'll bark at you. But it belonged to the colonial dames, and apparently they were finding it too hard to keep it up, and they sold it to this guy. George mentioned that Georgetown, as he said in his diary, seems to be in the shade of Charleston. Duh, still is. Suffered during the war by the British, having had many of its houses burnt. This was an important stop, was Hampton Plantation, which is now a state park. He had a lavish brunch there hosted by Harriet Pinckney Oree and her mother, Eliza Pinckney. And you probably heard a lot about Eliza the last few years. She was the subject of a very well-received novel called Indigo Girl. She was the person who made indigo, experimented it, and made it a viable crop. She was also married into a very prominent family, the Pinckneys. Well, this home belonged to Archibald Rutledge, who was the poet laureate of South Carolina. But at the time that he came here, Mrs. Oree had just changed the perspective of her house from facing the river to facing the carriageway. And there was this big oak tree in the front yard, and she was going to cut it down. And George Washington said, "Oh, please don't do that, because it takes a long time to grow a tree." And he talked her out of it. So it's 220 years later, this tree is still there. It's called the George Washington Oak. And you can walk around on the grounds here. They have rangers there sometimes, but self-guided tours is really beautiful. And they have done a really good job telling the lives of slave people who lived here at Hampton Plantation. Then he goes to Charleston, and that's when the park began. This is the house where he stayed on the left. The lady who was giving the guide there was British, which I thought was kind of interesting. And as we were going upstairs, she reminded us that George Washington's hand had been on that very banister, so we should all put our hands there, and of course we did. The other building is the old Exchange in Charleston. They had all kinds of parties and events for George Washington there, with women dressed up with their hair piled mile high, with all these ribbons woven in the hair that said, "Our leader, George Washington," with his portrait on it. I don't know, maybe ships in their hair, I don't know. But they were really dressed up, and George was just overcome. He would write in his diary that he had seen 272 women, count them, the likes of which I had never seen before. And, he had to go around and be nice with all the ladies. Now, and then, of course, this custom of toasting, followed by cannon fire, went on and on and on. From there, he went on down, had a couple of stops on the way, and wound up in Savannah, where he had another week of toasting and drinking and partying. There's a rumor that George Washington got so drunk drinking the local Chatham artillery punch that he swore he'd never come back to Savannah. And he didn't, but that's probably not why. George Washington was a social drinker, but he abhorred drunkenness. He was known for his rectitude and dignity. And he had had it up to here with drunken soldiers and officers during the Revolutionary War. It was a terrible problem for them. But he did enjoy various alcohols. He loved Madeira wine. That was his other favorite. But Madeira wine, which is like a port, is served in very small glasses, as you saw with that toasting portrait. So his granddaughter would say sometimes he would have 3 glasses after dinner. We're talking thimbles, John Wesley, who had died in 1791, the very year that George Washington came to Savannah. But he had already started having a tremendous impact on America. He had a very unhappy experience in Savannah. He suffered from what he called lust of the eyes. And he had wanted to be a celibate minister, but he kept getting entangled with these young women that he lusted after with his eyes. And he would lead them on, and then he'd say, "Oh no, but I must be celibate." So the last of these was a woman named Sophie Hopkey, who he kept saying he wanted to marry, but then he said he wouldn't. And then she said, well, fine, I'm happy just being your partner in ministry, and I'll be celibate too. Well, then Sophie ran off and got married in Charleston. And John Wesley was so angry, he refused to accept her marriage, and then he denied her communion. Big mistake. Her uncle, who she lived with, was the sheriff. And they pretty much searched, filled out a warrant on him, and it was, again, they passed an ordinance that no one could help him get out of town. So he had to be smuggled out of town on a boat with 3 very disreputable men who insisted on being paid with whiskey, which he had to do. And he got on a ship and went back to England. Wesley finally found his footing by establishing a sect within the Church of England known as Methodism. And his brother Charles became one of the great hymn writers of Methodism, and we all know some of his hymns. Hark the Herald Angels Sing is the best known probably. And they started sending missionaries to the United States and Ireland. And by the years before the Civil War, Methodism was the biggest denomination in the country, and they were driving that prohibition train. It's interesting, all the places on George Washington's trip, Methodist churches had already been planted there and were getting a toehold, and Methodists were dry. So that's what started leading the charge towards prohibition. It was disrupted slightly by the Civil War, wasn't everything, because Lincoln reinstated the excise tax, which Jefferson had done away with, to raise money for the Union Army. After the war was over, the excise tax, of course, was extended when the Confederate states came back into the hold. They didn't like that because they'd never had to pay a tax before, and that led to a lot of moonshining and blockading and running away from authorities and Snuffy Smith and the revenuers and all that kind of thing. So I go on with Prohibition, the crime wave that started as a result of it, and how people slowly started realizing it was just a really bad idea. It was repealed in 1933. And what resulted was all the states passing their own laws. So the last chapter of my book is about alcoholism, because as much as I joke about the drinking and the Methodists and the Episcopalians and all that, do you know the difference in a Methodist and a Baptist? The Methodist will speak to you at the liquor store. Why do you always bring 2 Baptists with you when you go fishing? If you bring one, he'll drink all the beer. Anyway, but alcoholism is a real serious problem. And interestingly enough, there was an organization that was a forerunner to AA that was started in the 1830s called the George Washington Society. They didn't know about George's history, I guess, as a distiller. And it was a self-help group for men that they were trying to keep each other from drinking. And it finally went away, and AA was started in 1935 by an alcoholic doctor and an alcoholic businessman, Dr. Bob and Bill W., and it's become really the template of the self-help movement. It has helped many, many people. Thank you so much. It's been fun being with you.